about 2007, Fortress Investment Group purchased the FEC company that we used to know, right? That owns that rail corridor and all the land holdings along the corridor, the right to operate freight. All those assets were purchased by a firm that's based out of New York, I believe, that has a variety of investment interests. One of them being railroads and the things that you can do along the rail corridor, let's say. So that private company restructured what we used to know as FEC. So now there are several different divisions. FECI is one of the divisions, and that's the one that's responsible for passenger rail development, which is the Elbord Ford project, as well as some of the real estate development. There are other divisions like FECR, Florida East Coast Railroad, retains the responsibility for operating the rail service, the freight service. There's a division that's responsible for broadband as well, parallel infrastructure, and they're actually proposing, in conjunction with the project, to install high-speed fiber optic along the FEC corridor, along the whole length of it, which is a significant infrastructure improvement for the region and state, a private infrastructure improvement, one that expands capacity in a different way. So with that said, FECI's proposal is to begin that service, let's say, down in Miami. Oh gosh, sorry about that. So there are 4 stations that are proposed: Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach. The service would then continue north in the FEC right-of-way and travel to the west along State Road 528. That would be new track being constructed along State Road 528. There's already an easement that's been secured by FECI to construct tracks in that corridor, an easement from FDOT. And the terminal station for this phase of service would be Orlando International Airport. And so it's a 235-mile corridor. There is no precedent for this type of project in the state or in the nation that we're aware of. It's caused a lot of frustration, I think, for agencies like mine, the Regional Planning Council, and for local governments, because normally a project of this magnitude would be carried forth by a public agency, like an FDOT or an SFRTA, a South Florida Regional Transportation Authority. So there'd be a whole series of public workshops and conceptual plans that would be reviewed by the public and vetted and influenced by a public process like that, long before we would get a stage where a project would be entering, actually already into the environmental impact statement process, which kind of gets into the permitting. And so this is a very different project, and the company's been quite clear. It is a private proposal that is proposed to be constructed on privately owned land with financing that is proposed to be secured through the Federal Railroad Administration, but with private collateral. And so it doesn't lend itself to that normal public input process that local governments and the agencies and frankly the public are really used to. And so that's created some frustrations. The council certainly felt that. You all may have as well. There's a lot of press about the project, and there are more questions than answers because we just don't have the level of information that we would normally have at this stage of a project development. Okay? So with that, our understanding is the project proposal, and many of you, of course, are probably quite familiar with it, but it's the operation of high-speed intercity express passenger rail service on the FEC corridor as well as State Road 528. Express means fewer stations and faster running trains, different than commuter rail service, which is slower service with much more access at a lower price point. A commuter service carries regular people to work and back, let's say, or to school and back. Express service is a different type of service. It's much more market-oriented, if you will. The proposal is not seeking any subsidies at this point that have been suggested by the company. The stations, as I mentioned, are proposed to be Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, and Orlando. The frequency is 16 hours of service from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., hourly service with 1 train in each direction each hour. So that means 32 trains additionally on the FEC corridor. Now it's important to make a distinction that passenger trains operate very differently than freight trains. So passenger trains typically clear an intersection in 45 to 60 seconds. And you're familiar with tri-rail service, and it's a 45 to 60 second crossing through the gates coming down, train passes, and gates open. Freight trains, of course, operate very differently. They have a very different footprint on the corridor. It's much longer for a freight train to move through, and it's moving more slowly and has a different vibration sound print and noise sound print than passenger service. And so that's just an important distinction to make with respect to that volume of trains and the ability for the transportation network to function. The company is maintaining a project time frame that suggests construction could begin the end of this year, 2014, and service could begin, a portion of service perhaps, in 2016. Many have suggested that's a very aggressive time frame, and all, I think, are waiting to see the project documentation to help us better inform our communities as to what's realistically expected with respect to time frame. With regards to permit activity, and my apologies, I should update this slide. The company did secure an initial environmental permit called an environmental assessment, and that was issued for the portion of the corridor between West Palm and Miami, and it was a fairly lean package of improvements. The double tracking in the corridor, which is replacing a track that historically was there in privately owned land, and grade crossing improvements, for which FEC retains full control over the grade crossings. That permit document, called an environmental assessment, did not address station locations in the kind of detail that they will be addressed in the EIS that's pending. It did not address the impacts on bridges, which has been a very focal point of discussion throughout the region. And there are 3 movable bridges in Fort Lauderdale and Jupiter, Tequesta, and Stewart that have generated a lot of public discussion. They are not the subject of the EA, the environmental assessment that was issued. It was exclusive to just the double tracking, really from West Palm to Miami. A very narrow conversation and a much leaner environmental document. A much bulkier environmental document, kind of the Cadillac, if you will, of environmental permitting, is an environmental impact statement. A much more detailed document, and that one will include all the other pieces of the project, which is the double tracking from West Palm to Cocoa, the construction of new track from Cocoa to Miami, all the grade crossings that would occur in that stretch, the construction of the stations, and the impacts on all the bridges, both the movable bridges, and there are 3, as well as the fixed bridges, and there are 6 fixed bridges that will be affected by the project. So that's on the horizon, and I have some time frames for you to consider. With respect to project history, this slide really summarizes the pieces of the project. So as you all know, FECI announced the project back in March of 2012. In 2012, the company submitted an application for what's called a RIF loan. That's a Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Loan. And that's a loan that's available under the FRA. That's the Federal Railroad Administration. There are 32 loans of this type that have been granted over time. They're available for either passenger improvements or freight improvements or both. There's some folks that think that they're only available for passenger. Well, actually they're available for both types of improvements. It is our understanding they operate like traditional commercial loans. The company has requested what it's explained is about a $1.5 billion request against a $2.25 billion project. That's the latest cost estimate that we've seen. Although all of the financial information related to that loan application remains confidential. It will be confidential and it will remain confidential going forward. And the staff at the FRA has explained to us there's proprietary information, it's just simply not available. That's also caused frustration amongst the public, but we have the information that we have. I mentioned to you already there was an environmental assessment that was prepared by the company. It was carried through with the FRA, and there was an approval granted in January of 2013. And so the company has the initial approvals, if you will, at several levels, but there's still some additional permitting perhaps that may be necessary to make that double track improvement from West Palm to Miami. With respect to the next project, the next piece of the project, which is the environmental impact statement, there were a series of what are called scoping meetings that were conducted back in May of last year. Folks from the city may have attended those, or your staff may have attended. And a scoping meeting is designed to do what the name says, broaden the scope of review by the agency. And so the Regional Planning Council submitted correspondence to the FRA identifying about 20 different issues that we heard about from the public and from the council. Impacts in communities, the desire for quiet zones, the desire for Tri-Rail's coastal link service to be advanced, and access fees determined as part of the review of this project. The introduction of additional stations in the northern part of the Treasure Coast. Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River have no stations, but they have a lot of impacts to the project. So all that stuff is on record. And where we are at this point is that the FRA received all those scoping comments back in May. The company submitted information to assist in the evaluation of those issues. And all of the 22 issues that are required to be addressed in the EIS, and I have a slide that details those for you. The FRA indicates it anticipates at this point the publication of what's called the draft EIS in the May-June timeframe. It's mid-May. I'm thinking perhaps it's more likely June or some point in the future. And so the publication of the EIS will be accompanied by a series of additional public workshops. The FRA will conduct those along the corridor. Imagine there'll be one probably in West Palm. That'll be the Palm Beach County workshop. They're open to the public, and they're designed to communicate information about the project to the public and receive public comments by the FRA. The public comment period by statute is 45 days. The Planning Council has asked that time frame be extended to 90 days, and many communities have requested that as well. It's obviously a very large-scale project. There's a lot of pieces, and we don't have a local agency to assist us in this very substantial transportation conversation that surrounds the introduction of service like this on the corridor. On Council's agenda, just for Commissioner Zerdy's knowledge, there is an additional action likely that the Council will ask all the local governments in the region to carry that same request forward so that the FRA can clearly hear the concern that the local governments and communities down here need a little more time to be able to process a document of this magnitude. Once the public comment period concludes, be it 45 days or some point longer, the FRA will receive that information, they will process it, they will likely get more information from the company, and then they'll produce what's called a final EIS. That'll generate another public comment period, which is 30 days at a minimum, might be longer if those requests follow as they have for the first one. And then the final step in that process is the issuance of what's called a record of decision. And from that point, any concerns that remain with the public or communities or others would move into a judicial process. It moves out of kind of the administrative world of the FRA, and it would move into a legal conversation. So that's a process that's coming up. Again, we expect to receive the document hopefully, maybe it's in the next month or two, and it'll start to answer some of the questions that have been raised to date. Pardon me. The FRA's best estimate is a process like this for a project of this magnitude would take at least a year, likely two, some drag on for many years, so several years, 3, 4, could be longer. And so it's not a fast-moving process, and it's designed to not be. It's designed to really lay out the issues, allow for the proper evaluation to take place, and help the agency make an informed decision about these types of projects that raise to this level of discussion. Okay? With respect to what's in the EIS, I promised there's another slide coming up that gave you that type of detail. And so in the EIS, the Federal Register actually notes the components that are required to be addressed. Commissioner Zerdy has raised on a number of occasions the concerns over east-west access to the corridor as well as north-south, and it's absolutely a concern the Council has raised consistently about the project. One of the components of an EIS is a complete transportation analysis that looks at all modes of transportation, so rail, cars, bikes, pedestrians, boats, planes, anything that's moving must be addressed in the transportation analysis, the study that's a part of the EIS. It also requires the evaluation on all of the components of environmental habitat, wetlands, endangered species, flood evaluation, socioeconomic considerations, public health and safety, kind of the whole range from soup to nuts, if you will. So it's a pretty bulky document that's coming, so we would suggest for the staff to be prepared. It'll be probably 1,500 pages with the attachments easily, and it'll take some time to get through. The Regional Planning Council has offered that we will assist local governments if there are particular issues that local governments would like the council to try to help them out with. We are also communicating on a regular basis with the Federal Railroad Administration as well as all the other review agencies. And on Council's agenda as well next week is a request to convene a workshop just for local governments, local government staffs, at the tail end of the public comment period with all the federal agencies. So we have a common point where the local governments can raise the concerns, positive or negative, issues or concerns, let's say, about the project, and be advised and informed as to how to best represent those in public comments that would be formally transmitted on the record. Okay? With respect to Council's involvement in the project, again, a point of frustration is there's no normal public input process that we're used to, so Council's just kind of taken on that role. And so we've been participating in public hearings like this one, and public workshops with neighborhood associations and other groups. We've done briefings one-on-one with elected officials and other types of meetings as well. And we will continue to play that role as a resource agency, and we'd be happy to go track down new information you have new information that you'd like us to try to go on. I have just briefly for you, I'll touch on issues the council raised back on March of this year. The council had a fairly substantial update with respect to the project, and based on all that public input, there was kind of a laundry list of issues that were raised for the council's consideration. And they covered the areas that are noted there in that first set of bullets. So there's been feedback we've received, concerns both positive and negative, with respect to passenger rail stations and passenger rail service, grade crossings at quiet zones, bridge and marine navigational conflicts, access to the broadband capacity that has already been identified as an improvement, the rationalization of freight, that means moving some of the freight out west so we have more capacity for passenger service where the people are, over here on the east, land use and transportation impacts, concluding or advancing, at a minimum, access negotiations with Tri-Rail to allow the Coastal Link service to advance, and wildlife impacts. So there's a fairly substantial letter that was transmitted by the council, and the city received a copy. It is also posted on the council's website that laid out all of these various issues, the concerns and opportunities that were identified for each of those, and mitigating measures. The purpose of that transmittal was to really continue to broaden the scope by the FRA as it finalizes the environmental impact statement, and to not overlook those issues that have been raised in public discussions. Council also asked the public comment period to be extended to 90 days, and finally, that in addition to the workshop I mentioned previously, that the FRA come down here and help local governments and agencies be prepared to get into the public comment discussion, because again, it's a fairly substantial project, and it's one that we don't have precedent for anywhere in the state or nation. And so we're asking them to come down and give us a hand so we can all have kind of our appropriate focus as we get into the public comment process for the EIS. With respect to those key issues, it's late. I won't spend a lot of time on these points, but these slides just summarize the main points. Adding additional stations along the corridor, quiet zone funding, pedestrian crossings. We've got plenty of pedestrians moving along the corridor, so they need a safe place to get across the tracks. The bridge and navigational conflicts are substantial with respect to the project, so modernizing the mechanisms and reducing impacts on the bridges. There are safety concerns that have been raised as well in Tequesta. Broadband capacity offers an opportunity for a public good to be created in the region, ancillary to the project, and so the council has consistently asked for a discounted rate to be established for local governments, educational users, hospitals, biotech, nonprofits that are in those cluster industries, so we can get discounted access to that as a public good to kind of offset some of the impacts that will come from the service's operations. It's a goodwill gesture, but you're certainly not going to have anything if you don't ask, so council again has asked consistently. I touched on the idea of freight rationalization. Again, that's the idea of balancing where trains are running and which types of land contexts they are occurring. So where there's not a need for heavy freight trains to run through populated urban downtowns, well, a rational approach would be to move those to the other set of tracks that run without interference. And so that freight rationalization issue has been picked up by the congressional delegation as well. It is a conversation between two private companies that both are benefited by running their own freight on their own corridor. And I wouldn't suggest there's anything other than full awareness of that condition. But this project provides the opportunity to open the door. And there are extensive relationships between the feds and the state with both of those companies individually. So there's ways to, in council's view, perhaps, facilitate a discussion that's at an opportune time. Land use and transportation impacts are particularly focused on property values and impacts in the downtowns. And there are a host of other issues that were raised by council as well, including a benefit cost analysis, which hasn't been available in any capacity to date. So with that, those comments were all transmitted to the FRA and we're awaiting a response. 3 other very short issues, I promise. The second one is the second issue of 4. This is the first of the quick ones. The FRA came down and participated in diagnostic field reviews in the whole corridor from, or rather most of the corridor, from Miami to St. Lucie County. Pardon me. The city probably participated in the diagnostic studies that were conducted along the grade crossings in Lake Worth. The FRA reviewed what we would presume to be some preliminary discussions with FEC, because we haven't seen any data that have come from, there's no list of what's going to happen in the grade crossings. But what we did receive was a copy of a field report from the FRA, which indicated the level of safety was of the highest importance. Disappointment with the level of safety that it understood was being advanced by the level of safety infrastructure, if you will, being suggested by the company. And it kind of raised the bar, if you will, and pointed to the high-speed rail guidelines, which are a guidance document produced by the FRA back in 2009 with respect to safety infrastructure along high-speed rail corridors. Now, Lake Worth isn't in the high-speed rail portion of the project. Lake Worth is in the 79-mile-an-hour portion of the project, which is from Miami to West Palm Beach. But with the amount of urban activity in this part of the corridor, likely those same types of improvements are going to be recommended in many parts of this urban part of the corridor, because we have so much pedestrian and vehicular activity going across the tracks. From West Palm North, the FRA said it needs to be a sealed corridor. And so we're waiting to see how this set of recommendations is implemented. Third item, the Regional Planning Council has established a portion of its website as a kind of an information clearinghouse on all aboard Florida. There wasn't another agency that had kind of picked up that charge. And so if you go to the council's website now, which is tcrpc.org, so that's Tom, Charlie, Roger, Paul, Charlie.org. If you scroll down, there's a header that says information about all aboard Florida, and all the information that we've been able to assemble is now posted there. So detail about these key points, contact information for the project, for the agencies that are responsible for the project, every federal agency, state and regional agency that has a review responsibility, all the local governments also listed as points of contact, because there's a lot of folks that will be reviewing these documents. So it's intended to make it easier for the public to be able to understand what's going on and track the project, if you will. We've also posted all the relevant documents that are out there. There aren't very many. So there's an environmental assessment and a finding of no significant impact. That was that first set of improvements that I mentioned. There's the FRA safety report and the water management district permit. That's essentially the package of documents that are available at this point, along with the notices letting folks know that the EIS is on its way. Once the EIS is posted, that'll be posted there as well. Okay? Final comment is that in addition to that project-related documentation, the council also is including all of the public comments that have been copied to the council with respect to the project that are authored by local governments or public agencies or elected officials. And so there's a fairly lengthy listing of public documentation, as well as all of the documentation, correspondence rather, the council has prepared with respect to the project. Just a sample of what we had received in the last couple of weeks. Many local governments are raising different issues for the consideration of the FRA and others, and the congressional delegation is weighing in as well. So with that, I apologize for the length of time. There's kind of a lot of pieces to this one, but I'll be happy to answer questions if you have them.
Thank you. Commissioner Morrison?
I just wanted to stress, I think one of our biggest issues that we've talked about up here is we have 13 crossings. We can't afford to upgrade them, quiet zones and the upgrades and everything. We really need the funding for that. So I just want to go on record saying, you know, that's really one of our biggest needs. We've talked about it over and over, is the funding for both the upgrades and the quiet zones.
Right. And I didn't mention in the slides, there's a $10 million allocation for an FDOT-managed grant program that's in the state budget now, that's headed to the governor's office for approval. If funded, that tranche of funds would be available on a 50-50 basis to match other local or other funds for quiet zone infrastructure. In addition, the Palm Beach MPO, where the mayor is a member, and the Broward MPO together just submitted on Monday a Tiger Grant application for just under $21 million. And that's intended to provide 50% funding for quiet zones throughout both counties, all of Palm Beach County and all of Broward County. And so many are hopeful that, you know, shake the tree long enough, something will fall out. So I think there's good progress in trying to bring down some dollars. There's also a very extensive discussion all the time with FECI and the Federal Railroad Administration about the concerns over safety and the desire for increased safety infrastructure. Of course, that's synonymous with the type of infrastructure necessary for quiet zones. Those two things go together, though they're technically different. And so again, all are hopeful, I think, that there will be some break for local governments, and that's been a consistent point that's been expressed across the board in the correspondence the council's received.
And Kim, just one thing, and the upgrades themselves minus the quiet zones
Right.
will be covered by,
All Ward Florida,
that's
right.
right.
So,
Remember we mentioned that last time?
yes, in September of last year, Olive Ward, Florida issued a statement, I guess, indicating that it would pay for the safety infrastructure required to operate the service. So there are the baseline infrastructure that's necessary. If 2 quadrant gates have to become 4 quadrant gates for safe operation, for safety, well, Olive Ward, Florida has said it would pay for those improvements. There's still an operating and maintenance cost, and that's something not to be overlooked, right? Because the city would retain responsibility for the grade crossings, but the big ticket item, which is getting the gates in the ground, for example, that's a safety improvement, that's gonna be carried by the project.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot. What's the
I read a lot.
what's the significance of the 79 mile an hour speed from Miami to West Palm?
It's a class 5 section of railroad, just like Tri-Rail. And so that's a pretty standard operating speed. What that means from a safety standpoint is that slower speed train service provides a higher safety rating, if you will. It's not as hard to establish a quiet zone on a 79 mile an hour portion of a corridor as it is at a 110 mile an hour portion, because the speed of the trains, both the volume and speed of the trains, affects the safety rating. So from a significance standpoint, it makes it just a little bit easier if quiet zones are the goal. Then it should not be as difficult to raise the level of safety from a numbers standpoint to allow the city to establish quiet zones.
So in theory, if they wanted to run those trains at, say, in excess of 80 miles an hour from Miami, they would be responsible for upgrading the safety standards, which you just mentioned a moment ago, are in many cases very similar or synonymous with what is required for a quiet zone, which means the cost associated with that would probably be borne by the private company and not by local municipalities.
Right. It's true theoretically, but given the urban conditions that we have, I'm not aware of any ability for that corridor to be designed at 80 mile an hour service because of the number of grade crossings. So I think it's, unless you were to elevate the track or elevate all the grade, separate all the grade crossings, I don't think it's in my professional opinion, I don't think it's a feasible scenario. So I think a 79 mile an hour service is pretty standard, and that's, again, similar to what Tri-Rail runs today. So it's just, I don't think they can go there.
Does Tri-Rail run at 79 miles an hour?
When it
It's
gets
a
up to
class
full
5
speed.
corridor, yeah.
Okay.
And by the way, all the Tri-Rail corridor was designed with quiet zone infrastructure. That was part of the double tracking improvement. Not every community established quiet zones, but all are able to because that infrastructure was installed. And I think there's 13. Did Lake Worth establish a quiet zone? Did Lake Worth?
Part of it did.
Part of it.
Yeah, I think there's 13 communities that have quiet zones in place.
Thank you.
Commissioner Zerbe?
Well, I definitely want to thank you, Kim, for taking time, and she really did condense this a lot. Believe it or not.